Welcome to City Church's on-demand messages. My name's Josh, and I'm the pastor here, and we're so thankful that you're tuning in whenever you're tuning in, wherever you're tuning in from. In fact, we would love to connect with you. If you're new, or if you've maybe tuned in a couple times but haven't connected with us, we would love for you to text NEW to the number on the screen right now. We've got a free gift for you, and we would love to serve you and get to know you a little bit better. Also, we would love to pray with you or for you. Whatever's going on in your life, or maybe the lives of those around you. And so if you need prayer, text NEXT to the number on the screen right now, and we'll connect with you. We'll reach out and join with you in prayer, because we believe that prayer is a powerful tool that we have to connect with God on behalf of those that we care about and those that we love. We are in a series called Citizens Culture. We believe that God calls us as citizens of the kingdom of heaven to live our everyday lives differently than really everyone else. And so this series is about us looking at the book of Ephesians and what Paul calls the church of Ephesus into, what he invites them into, and asking the question, what does this mean for our lives, and how can we invite more people into this same culture? We hope that you enjoy and are encouraged by this week's message.
But this morning, I love the fact that I get the opportunity to take us to Ephesians chapter 5. If you haven't been with us here at City Church, we have been talking about the book of Ephesians, and specifically this, citizens' culture. How do we allow the culture around us to affect the life that we live, the life that we know? And so we have said this from the beginning. The book of Ephesians is this: a celebration of God's saving power and a guide to getting in on the fun. And so in the first 3 chapters, we saw that beginning piece. We saw this celebrating of God's power, His love, who Jesus is, what He's done for us. And then last week, we began to see, as Josh unraveled, this guide towards getting in on the fun. And so Josh used this example in chapter 4, right? These first 3 chapters, we see God's love. And then here we come in chapter 4, and it's this guide to how we should live. And so Josh gave this example of coming from the couch to a 5K. In other words, you get up, right, and you do the work, right? You step into a space where you train. And he said this: never underestimate the power of repeated obedience, right? In order to run that 5K, you've got to get in this repetitive process. And so he talked about this obedience. I think it's huge that the book of Ephesians does something that's hugely important, I think, and something that maybe should let us breathe a little bit when we talk about this guide to living as Christ would call us to live. You see, the book of Ephesians doesn't start with, hey, here's how you should live. This is how you should walk. This is how you should live in life. Here's the guide. Now, guess what? I love you. That's not how Ephesians is unfolded. See, Paul writes the book of Ephesians, and he starts with this first piece, and he says, here is what Jesus has done. Here is His love expressed to you and the life that He gave on the cross for you, the grace that He gave. Now go and live. Now step into this guide. Now walk. You see, I think maybe it should just move us into a space of breathing and say, you know what? It's not walk. Oh, yes, I love you. It's no, I love you. And so this love that I give you should express itself in the way that we live. You see, I think we can really breathe in this, that from Christ, love overflows how we live. You see, it's His love first, and then that's what overflows into how we live. It's not here, it's how you should live. And oh, and guess what? I love you. But no, sit in my love. Learn from me. Learn from the way that I have loved you. Because here's what happens, right? We see that in the first 3 chapters. And then in chapter 4, the guide begins. And in chapter 5, it continues. And this is what happens. In Ephesians chapter 5, verse 1, therefore be imitators of God as beloved children. You see, because of the things, so we see that verse says, therefore be imitators of God. The therefore is there for a reason. Because of the things in chapter 4 of putting away that obedience Josh talked about, and most importantly, those first 3 chapters, because of the things that He has done in this call to obedience, be imitators of God and walk. And we're going to see this in a second, as His beloved children. I love that Paul gives this example. So he says, be imitators of God, just like children. And you say, why does he give us this example? Let me ask you a question. To the parents out there or to those that have seen kids, whether it's nieces and nephews, whoever it may be, have you ever seen a child do something, maybe your own child? Because I know in my life with my child, I have seen this. Where did they learn that from? Where in the world where? Let me just for a moment, all right? Maybe you don't want to put this in the chat, but I'm going to ask you. What is something your child has learned from you that you saw and you were like, oh, man. Where did they learned that from me. What is something that maybe your child is, right? Because children imitate. I'll never forget, I was sitting at a dinner somewhere and with some friends. This was a long time ago. And we got done eating, and this 3-year-old sitting at the table, this is a friend, and the 3-year-old sits back and goes, oh, and then rubs her tummy and says, that was good. And I'm like, where in the world? And the dad is looking at me, and he is dying laughing, and he says, I do that all the time, right? Because children, they imitate. What is something that you have, right, put in front of your child, they're imitated, and you've seen them do? And so this is the example that Paul sets for us. He says, be imitators of God just like children, because they follow what they see in front of them. And there's one thing I think specifically that maybe we aren't aware of that our children, that we as children did and imitate. And it's this. It's walking. Right? Something that maybe we don't think about or that they imitate, but our children, right? You as a child, you watched as your parents walked. I would love to know what's going on in the mind of a child as they're watching, thinking like, I can't do that. Like, what's going on? They're moving on their feet, and I can't even stand on them. But it's something that eventually, right, that eventually it happens. I'll never forget the first time our 11-year-old walked. I remember just this moment of just me on one side, my wife on one side. He was only 8 months old. By the end of 8 months, he was running. But there was this continual working and process towards that first day of steps. It wasn't just like he got up and just started walking. There was this process that took place, and we guided him along the way, right? We're holding his hand. We're setting him up on the side of the couch. We are making sure that he doesn't fall and hit his head or whatever the case may be. We're there with him in that process of walking. This is the example that Paul gives us that we would walk. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 2, right away, as he talks about this imitation, he says this in verse 2, and walk in love. So be imitators just like children and walk. Walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. And so he says, hey, be imitators just as children, and here's how you walk in love. The word walk here in this passage means to progress. It literally means a journey. Much like, right, a child learning to walk, it doesn't happen automatically, right? You learn that process. So this is this journey of walking in love. All those amazing things that we dove into about Christ's love in chapter 1, 2, and 3 are things we continue to learn, and they lead us in how we should walk. Those incredible things that Josh unraveled in those first 3 chapters, they lead us towards this. You see, Christ doesn't call us to walk in love without first being the example of love for us. So he hasn't called you and me and said, hey, you know what? Do not as I do, but as I say. Have you ever found yourself as a parent, or maybe you heard that, like, hey, you do as I say, don't do as I do. But no, Jesus says, listen, do as I have done. I have loved you, and so you should love. What an incredible example he's given us. And so the first thing that Paul unravels in this passage is, hey, be imitators of God. And the way that we do this, we walk in love just as Christ has loved. 1 John 4:9 says, we love because he first loved us. The reason that our love overflows is not because what we have done, but because what he has done first. We love best when we are reminded of Christ's love daily for us. Maybe you're working, trying to earn that love. Let me just let you rest this morning in the fact that he loves you first. And from his love, from being found in that peace, we can love best and we can walk in love. After verse 2, after he calls us to this walking in love, Paul unfolds in verses 4 through 7 these things that are really opposite of this true love. He unfolds these things that maybe sometimes we don't even want to talk about. Things that he describes as darkness. And these things have one thing in mind. You see, they're the opposite of how Christ walked in love. There's one thing in mind in these things, and it's self. Verse 3 talks about sexual immorality. A love that would impose itself for the gratitude of self. He talks about impurity. He talks about coveting or greed. He talks about filthy talk. At the heart of these things, right, is opposite of how we should walk in love. These things he even calls sin in verse 3 and says they have no place for those who believe in Jesus. He calls these things sin and darkness. These are evidences, right, that we would not be walking in love, but we would be walking in self. It's so counterculture, isn't it? As we talk about being a citizen culture and we talk about being in this citizen mindset of who Jesus is and being a Christian, there's so much in today's world that is counter to that because we live in a world, right, that's so much about love for self, self-help, getting the best for self. You've got to get yours, right? It's the world that we live in. The Bible is clear, right, that we should love ourselves. It says we should love our neighbor as we love ourselves, but there's something that must stand differently. Our love for self is never about what I can get from me, but it's allowing Jesus to love right through me. It's that sense of worth of Jesus loving through me that I may love others towards Jesus. It's counterculture to give up of self. But he says, be imitators of who God is. Be imitators of that love. And if we imitate that love, if we walk in that love, right, it is a love that is selfless. It is a love that put others first. He pushes so strong away from these sins of selfishness that in verse 6 and 7, he says, let no one deceive you with empty words. Because of these things, the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. Therefore, do not become partners with them. Don't connect with these things. Walk, though, in love. In considering these things of darkness, these things that are opposite of love, Paul moves us to this next step, right? Because walking, like as we learn to walk, as our children learn to walk, there's steps that are involved, right? It's not just, I get on my feet and I'm good to go. There's this one step at a time that we're moving as a child as we learn. And so he gives us this next step in verse 8 of chapter 5. He says, for at one time you were darkness. In other words, darkness consumed you. But now you are light in the Lord. Because of what Jesus has done, you are now light in the Lord. Now he says this, walk as children of light. So we walk in love, but we also walk in light. Light is that thing that is visible, right? When you think about light, you think about a switch coming on and light is visible. It exposes the dark. It's the part that emits, right? Light emits, it shows. You see, we've undergone this change, he's saying. Paul's saying, because of what Jesus has done, because you've accepted him, you've undergone this change, and no longer do you have this darkness, but you should be living and walking in light. The thing about light and dark, though, is that it's either one or the other, right? If you walk into a dark room, let me ask you a question, put it in the chat. Are you afraid of the dark? Are you afraid of the dark? I mean, it's okay. If you're an adult and you're still afraid of the dark, I would say that I am not a big fan of the dark. Like, I'm not just going to be like, you know what, guys, let's sit in the dark right now. Are you still in that place? Because we know this, right? It's either light or dark. And so the thing that we do when we go in a dark room, right, is we turn on the light. It's either on or off. If the light is on, there is light. If the light is off, there is darkness. And so this is what Paul is saying, that we should walk in light. 1 John 1, verse 5 through 6 says, this is the message we heard from him and proclaimed to you. Just listen to this, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. If we say we have fellowship with him while we walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. And so if we're walking in darkness, we're living a lie. We're living out of that fellowship. It doesn't mean that the relationship is gone, but we're living out of the fellowship. Much like the conflict that happens right between a son and a father, or a daughter and a mother, when there's friction, when there's this walking in darkness between that relationship, the relationship still exists, but the fellowship is friction. And so Paul is encouraging us to walk as children of light. He gives us the way to walk in light, and I love this. He says in verse 9 through 11 of chapter 5, for the fruit of light. Some of your passages, your versions may say the fruit of the Spirit is found in all that is good and right and true. And try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. You see, how do we discern? Because it says to discern. How do we discern these things? How do we discern what is dark and what is light? We do that through His Word. Right? We do that through the first part of this passage, the fruit of light or the fruit of Spirit, guiding us. As you discern, it says, as you begin to see what is dark, take no part. Expose them in your personal life. How, though, can I see the darkness? How can I see the darkness in my life? I think this is probably the best way to put it. We cannot see the darkness if we haven't turned on the light. And so the question would be this morning, if you're walking in darkness, is that fellowship there? Are you turning on the light daily, right? Is this it for you? Is like Sunday morning it? Is this the only light you're receiving is just today? And we are glad that you're here so much 100%. But daily, are you turning that light on to walk in light, to be reminded of the light that has been placed in your life by Christ so that you may expose the darkness in your life by being in His Word, by being in prayer, by being in fellowship with those that call Jesus their Savior. That is how we walk in light. So we walk in this love and we walk in this light, and Paul gives us this next piece. And I always kind of thought that these were separate pieces, that we walk in love and we walk in light, and then we walk in this, but it kind of takes us back to those first two. It makes me think in this passage about those first couple weeks that your child is learning to walk, right? You don't just say, all right, you did it, and then you just leave them alone. No, you are there helping them guide and making sure they're making just smart decisions in walking, because let's be honest, when they first get that first few steps, they're like, I got this, I can do it. And they go down, right? And so we're walking along, making sure that they're making those wise decisions as they learn those steps. And so this is what he says in Ephesians 5, verse 15 through 16. Look carefully then how you walk. So what are we looking carefully at? How we walk in love and how we walk in light. And he says, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of time because the days are evil. He says, look carefully, diligently. Are you walking in love towards others? And are you living in light, not in darkness? Are you living for self, or are you living for Christ, for others? Are you making decisions that would keep you in the dark and not exposing them by the light that lives in you? The word wise in this passage means to form the best plan for execution. So to form the best plan of execution to walk in love and walk in light, I think we have to first go back to those first three chapters, and you have to sit in the fact that Jesus has given himself for you, that your worth and your value is simply resting in that peace, that he loves you unconditionally. And then we have to plan that execution to be reminded of that love so that we may walk in love and walk in light by knowing him more, by investing our life in him more. That's how we can begin to make this right plan of execution, making the best use of our time. When we walk in love and light, I think we will find ourselves using our time better. That our hearts and our minds would change, and that we would use that time we have with our family. We would use that time in our workspace. We'd use that free time even better because of how we're walking in love and how we're walking in light. Immediately after this, Paul gives us the best way to make sure that we're walking wisely and making the best use of our time. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 18. And I think that we can just take this verse by itself and say, well, this is what it says, and it's the only thing it applies to, but this is really bringing this whole picture of how we walk together. And do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, which is indulgence to self, but be filled with the Spirit. Do not get drunk with wine, for that is indulgence to self, but be filled with the Spirit. I think it's so incredible as I studied this passage that Paul would talk so much about walking, and then he would put in this drunk with wine. Because if you're drunk, guess what? You're not walking right. You're staggering. Your path is unclear. Your mind has lost focus. You're not making the right decisions in that moment. And so this is not just, hey, this is a standalone verse. This is going back to this whole concept of walking in love and light wisely. And if I am filled with something other than the Spirit, then I cannot walk in the right way. My path is very staggered. So yes, right, we should not be drunk, but it's more than this passage. It just says this. It's do not fill yourself with anything that may take the place of His Spirit. Man, this is how we walk wisely. Both of these fill us, right? And they both affect our decision making. Being drunk with wine and being filled with the Spirit, they affect how we live, our decisions, and how we walk. If I'm full of drink, I'm definitely not going to be full of the Spirit. But let me ask this question. What are you filling yourself with that is leading you to not walk wisely in love and in light? What is it that you're filling yourself up with that is not love that Christ gives and light that He gives, but you're filling yourself with hoping that maybe it gives you value or worth? The spectrum could be wide in this capacity. It could be money. It could be social media. It could be the likes and the comments of social media. It could be your job. It could be your spouse. The list could span so far, the things that we would fill ourselves with. It could be alcohol. It could be an addiction. But what is it that you're filling yourself up with, hoping that it would allow you to walk right? And you're missing that Jesus says, hey, walk in love and light. And let me tell you something. I've given you an example. I've set out the steps for you and how I love and how I shine brightly in darkness. Paul leads us this way of walking because he knows how it will play out in our relationships. And so he sets up this whole chapter to lead us into the end of chapter 5 and the beginning of chapter 6, that we need to best live out our relationships by walking in love and walking in light wisely and not filling ourselves with anything but the Spirit of God, because our relationships are going to come into play. He gives us this relationship in chapter 5, verse 24 through 25. He says this: Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husband, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave Himself up for her. And so he gives us this picture of the church and Jesus. And so this word that we see for wives is this word submit. This is not a right for a husband to abuse. Husbands, I would say that if you're loving your wife as Christ loved the church, I would say that it breathes this beauty and this picture. And what it allows you to do is lead the way that God has called you to lead. To lead your family and your wife towards Jesus. And so wives, we see as that we walk in light and love that we can live out this picture of the church. And husband, love your wives. Just as Christ loved the church and He gave Himself up for her. This picture is simply this, right? Be imitators. We see that Jesus gave Himself up. So husbands, let me ask you, and I challenge myself in this, are you giving yourself up for your wife? Is your love look like the love Jesus gave you? Because we walk in love and we walk in light wisely, filling ourselves right with His Spirit versus anything else that we would seek to fill us, then our relationships begin to change. In chapter 6, we see the relationship between a worker and an employer. That relationship begins to change. It looks different in how we treat others with the goal in mind versus what I get for self to, hey, I want to lead you in love towards Jesus. It changes everything. And so I have this question for you. If you're here this morning and as it pushes us towards relationships, fill in the blank right now. Right now, my marriage is. My friendship right now with is. As a parent right now, my relationship with my child is. As a son or a daughter, my relationship is. As an employee or as an employer, my relationship is. And whatever that heaviness is that exists, I would bring you back to this question: how is your walk? How is your walk? And I think as we ask that question, we must point ourselves back to who Jesus is, who he is in his love and grace in chapters 1, 2, and 3, and his call now to imitate who he is. He goes first for us. He represents first for us. To this day, I can still remember Gage, our 7-year-old. He's walking, learning to walk. We're on vacation. And at this point, we put everything down. Like, we had plans, we were going somewhere, but he's just ready to go. So there we are in our room on vacation. My wife's on one side, I'm on the other side. And let's be honest, in these moments, I wish I had maybe I don't wish, but I kind of wish I had a screen or a video going of my face, right? Because this is the faces that you make as parents where if someone saw this face out of context, they'd be like, what is wrong with that person? Because you're just like, all right, come on, you can do it. You just have these goofy faces, but you're so excited and full of love just to see them walk. I think that we can imagine for just a second that is Jesus. That he is so full of overwhelming joy and love to see us walk. To see us imitate him. And that he's there in those moments, just like I was for our 7-year-old as he began to fall. And I would help him back up. And I would begin again to help move in those steps towards walking. Let me ask you again this question. What are you filling yourself with that is leading you to not walk wisely in love and in light? May I encourage you to go back to chapters 1 and 3 and see how Christ loved us first. Go back and see. That's where you have to start. See how he loved, because if we're going to imitate, we need to be reminded of that love and that light. Because here's what Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8 through 9. This is not on the screen. I just want you to listen. Soak this in. God saved you by his grace when you believed. You can't take credit for this. It's a gift from God. A gift. Salvation is not a reward for the good things we've done. Right? We don't walk first. We live in his love. It's not what we've done. So none of us can boast. Verse 10, for we are God's masterpiece. He has created us anew in Christ Jesus so we can do the good things he planned for us long ago. He has good things planned for us from long ago. As we step into the reminder of who he is, it begins to move us towards this guide to get in on the fun, right? Because when a child starts to walk, I think sometimes we would go back and be like, you know what, I wish I wouldn't have made them walk so soon, because they're having way too much fun. We begin to walk in love and light. It begins to flesh out into this joy in our relationships, in our life personally, something that we could ever ask or imagine. So I would say to you, stop working, start walking in his love and light. After I pray, we have just a moment of worship through song. And in this song, you're going to just hear these words that nothing else will do. So maybe you're sitting on your couch. Maybe you just kind of want to whisper these words as they're sung. Maybe you just want to listen to them. But I pray that you're reminded today that nothing else will do. The chapters 1, 2, and 3, they set us up best to walk in light and in love. Let's pray. God, we thank you so much for this morning. And God, we thank you just for, and we thank you for your love and light in our lives. And in the name of Jesus, I pray right now for the person who's listening online, who is wrestling in darkness, who is wrestling in selfishness. God, I pray against anything the enemy would do to convince them that they don't need to move into your love and light. God, I pray that in my life personally, in my marriage, as a father, in my relationships, God, that I would walk in love and light that leads people back to who you are. God, thank you for every person who's here right now with us online. God, may they right now in this moment, they feel your presence. And as this song is sung, God, may we be reminded of who you are and that there's nothing else that can fill us. There's nothing else that will fill us like you, like your Spirit, and allow us to walk best in relationship with others. In your name we pray. Amen.